Marcus Webb had always figured that being the only human janitor on an interstellar research station would be weird, but nobody had warned him about the soul-crushing boredom of cleaning up after the most methodical species in the galaxy. The Xanthari didn't just follow rules, they worshipped them like tiny gray gods with clipboard accessories. Every morning at precisely 0600 hours, Marcus would watch the Xanthari researchers file into Harmony Prime's corridors with the enthusiasm of wet concrete. Their elongated heads bobbed in perfect synchronization, their large dark eyes staring straight ahead, and their movements so coordinated you could set a metronome to their footsteps. It was like living inside a really depressing dance routine that nobody asked for. "Morning, Commander Zilthon," Marcus would say cheerfully to the station's head administrator, a particularly rigid Xanthari whose idea of casual conversation was reciting maintenance schedules. Zilthon would respond with a curt nod and continue his inspection rounds, checking that every surface gleamed with regulation-approved shine. The worst part, they never made a mess. Marcus spent 8 hours a day cleaning up after beings who apparently had evolved beyond the concept of dropping crumbs or leaving coffee rings. His biggest excitement came from finding the occasional dust particle that had dared to settle somewhere it shouldn't. Revolutionary stuff, really. But on this particular Tuesday, or what passed for Tuesday in a space station that operated on Galactic Standard Time, Marcus discovered something that would make his janitorial career significantly more interesting. While running diagnostics in Maintenance Bay 7, he heard sounds that definitely weren't in the Xanthari emotional repertoire. Soft chittering noises, almost like curiosity? Following the sound through a maze of ventilation shafts, Marcus found himself peering through a grate into a hidden chamber he'd never seen on any station schematics. Inside, a group of young Xanthari cubs, maybe 6 or 7 of them, sat in perfect rows, while an adult Xanthari droned through what sounded like the galactic equivalent of tax code. Regulation 47 Alpha states that all beings must maintain emotional equilibrium during work hours, the instructor intoned. Repeat. Regulation 47 Alpha states that all beings must maintain emotional equilibrium during work hours, the cubs chanted back in tiny monotone voices. Marcus felt something twist in his chest. These kids, and they were kids, even if they looked like miniature versions of their elders, were being programmed into the same joyless existence as every other Xanthari on the station. No wonder the adults moved around like they were powered by bureaucratic batteries. He was about to crawl away when one of the cubs glanced up directly at him. Their eyes met through the grate, and Marcus saw something he'd never seen in an adult Xanthari. Genuine curiosity. Not the clinical, research-orientated kind, but the pure, wondering curiosity of a child who just spotted something completely outside their experience. The cub tilted its head, and Marcus found himself grinning despite the absurdity of the situation. Here he was, a human janitor, about to potentially commit first contact with alien children through a ventilation shaft. His life had officially reached peak weird. Regulation 72 Beta, the instructor continued, oblivious to the small revolution happening in the back row. All beings must suppress non-productive emotional responses. Marcus looked at the curious cub, then at its classmates dutifully repeating their lessons in joyless unison. Something rebellious sparked in his chest, the same feeling that had gotten him into trouble back on Earth, and apparently was about to get him into trouble 47 light-years away from home. Time to teach some alien kids what they were missing. The next day, Marcus arrived at Maintenance Bay 7 with a plan that could charitably be called winging it. He'd spent the night researching Xanthari child development protocols, which, unsurprisingly, read like an instruction manual for building robots, and concluded that these cubs had never experienced anything resembling fun. Time to fix that cosmic injustice. He waited until the cubs' afternoon lesson began, then carefully removed the ventilation grate and dropped into the chamber with all the stealth of a human-sized bowling ball. 7 pairs of large dark eyes immediately fixed on him, while their instructor, a particularly stern-looking Xanthari Marcus mentally dubbed Professor Buzzkill, froze mid-lecture about proper waste disposal procedures. "Oh, hey there," Marcus said, dusting off his jumpsuit and giving the cubs a casual wave. "Don't mind me, just your friendly neighborhood human. Carry on with your riveting discussion of garbage protocols." The cubs stared at him like he'd materialized from another dimension, which, considering he was the first human they'd ever seen, wasn't far from the truth. "You are not authorized to be in this educational facility," Professor Buzzkill announced, his voice carrying all the warmth of a tax audit. "I am Keeper Vorthak, Instructor of Developing Minds. You will remove yourself immediately." Right, unauthorized entry. Got it. Marcus nodded seriously. Then he turned to the cubs and made a ridiculous face. Eyes crossed, tongue sticking out, the whole 9 yards. The reaction was instantaneous. Every cub's head jerked back in surprise, their eyes widening to nearly comic proportions. One of them made a sound Marcus had never heard from a Zenthari before, a soft choking noise that might have been the beginning of laughter. "What are you doing to them?" Vorthak demanded, stepping protectively in front of his students. "Showing them what their faces can do besides look serious," Marcus replied. He addressed the cubs directly. "You guys know you can move your facial muscles for reasons other than official expressions, right? Watch this." He proceeded to demonstrate the fine art of human facial comedy, raising one eyebrow, puffing out his cheeks, wiggling his ears. The cubs were transfixed, their usual perfect posture forgotten as they leaned forward to get a better look. "You are corrupting their educational process," Vorthak protested. "Oh, come on," Marcus said, never breaking eye contact with the cubs. "When's the last time you saw these kids actually interested in something? Look at them. They're engaged. That's more than I can say for your waste disposal lecture." He demonstrated a simple joke, pretending to pull his thumb off and wiggling it separately. The cubs gasped in unison, and that choking sound came again, louder this time. One of them, the curious one who'd first spotted him, actually smiled. Not the polite regulation-approved expression Zenthari used for formal occasions, but a genuine, delighted smile. "Stop that immediately," Vorthak snapped. "You are introducing chaos into ordered minds." "I'm introducing joy into bored kids," Marcus shot back. "There's a difference." He turned back to the cubs and tried something different, a simple wordplay. "Hey, why don't scientists trust atoms? Because they make up everything." Silence. Then, slowly, one of the cubs tilted its head and made that choking sound again. This time it evolved into something unmistakably like laughter, high-pitched, surprised, and absolutely delighted. The sound was contagious. Within seconds, all 7 cubs were making similar noises, their small bodies shaking with this new, wonderful sensation. Vorthak looked horrified. "What have you done to them?" "Taught them to laugh," Marcus said, grinning as the cubs continued their symphony of giggles. "Pretty neat trick, right? Humans figured it out about 50,000 years ago. We're quick learners." This is unacceptable," Vorthak sputtered. "They are supposed to be learning essential galactic protocols, not engaging in whatever this is." "This," Marcus said, watching the cubs try to recreate his facial expressions with varying degrees of success, "is what childhood is supposed to look like." Vorthak's expression hardened into something approaching anger, the most emotion Marcus had ever seen from a Zenthari. "You will not return here. These developing minds are not your concern." Marcus looked at the cubs, who were still experimenting with this amazing new ability to laugh, their eyes bright with discovery. "Yeah," he said quietly. "We'll see about that." Over the next week, Marcus developed what he liked to call Operation Gigglestorm, a covert campaign to introduce basic human humor to 7 alien children through a ventilation system. It was either the most ridiculous thing he'd ever done, or the most important. Possibly both. He'd sneak into the hidden chamber during the cubs' break periods when Vorthak was off filing reports about their satisfactory progress in emotional suppression. The cubs would gather around him like he was some kind of comedy prophet, their dark eyes wide with anticipation. "Okay, today's lesson is about puns," Marcus announced during one session, pulling out a makeshift visual aid he'd cobbled together from station supplies. "These are jokes that play with words that sound alike but mean different things. For example, why did the photon check into a hotel? Because it was traveling light." The cubs stared at him blankly for a moment, processing this new concept. Then little Zek, Marcus had started giving them human nicknames since their real names were unpronounceable strings of clicks, suddenly burst into delighted laughter. "Light means not heavy, but also the electromagnetic radiation we see with," Zek explained to his classmates, with the serious tone of someone making a scientific discovery. "It is humor because it means both things at once." "Exactly," Marcus grinned. "You're getting it." Soon, the cubs were creating their own attempts at humor. They were terrible at it, but their enthusiasm was infectious. Pip tried to make a joke about gravity that didn't quite work but made everyone laugh anyway. Noodle attempted physical comedy by pretending to trip, which sent the whole group into hysterics. But Marcus started noticing changes beyond their secret sessions. The cubs were carrying their newfound joy back into their regular classes. They'd exchange meaningful glances during Vorthak's lectures, clearly sharing some private joke. Occasionally, one would accidentally let out a small giggle during a particularly absurd regulation recitation. Worse, or better, depending on your perspective, other young Zenthari from different educational groups began hanging around the cubs during communal mealtimes. Marcus watched from his janitorial post as the 7 conspirators unconsciously brightened up any room they entered, drawing curious youngsters like moths to a very giggly flame. "Did you see Facility Maintenance Protocol ZIX 947? Zek asked loudly during one meal, his voice carrying across the cafeteria. "The one about cleaning supply storage temperatures?" His classmates immediately perked up, recognizing this as setup for one of their new jokes. "No, what about it?" Pip responded, playing her part perfectly. "It says all cleaning fluids must be kept at exactly -40 degrees, Zek continued with mock seriousness. "I guess you could say it's a pretty cool rule." The 7 cubs erupted into laughter, while the other young Zenthari looked bewildered but fascinated by this strange new behavior. A few even made hesitant sounds that might have been attempts at laughter themselves. That's when Commander Zilthon started paying attention. Marcus first noticed the commander's interest during his regular maintenance rounds. Zilthon would appear in corridors where the cubs gathered, his large eyes observing their behavioral anomalies with the intensity of a scientist studying a particularly interesting specimen. "The developing minds are exhibiting unusual patterns," Zilthon mentioned to Vorthak during a conversation Marcus definitely wasn't supposed to overhear. "They demonstrate increased vocalization and facial muscle movement. Their emotional regulation scores have declined significantly." "I have noticed these irregularities," Vorthak replied stiffly. "I suspect outside contamination." Marcus nearly choked on his coffee. Contamination. They were talking about laughter like it was a disease. The situation reached critical mass during the monthly educational progress inspection. Commander Zilthon, accompanied by several high-ranking Zenthari officials, toured the cubs' classroom to observe their development. Marcus watched from his convenient hiding spot in the ventilation shaft, holding his breath. Everything went smoothly until Vortak began demonstrating the cubs' mastery of Regulation 12 Delta, proper responses to emergency evacuation procedures. "When the evacuation alarm sounds," Vortak intoned, "all beings must proceed to designated safety zones in an orderly fashion. Repeat." "When the evacuation alarm sounds," the cubs began in unison, "all beings must proceed to designated safety zones in an orderly." Noodles started giggling. She couldn't help it. Something about the phrase orderly fashion struck her as hilarious. Maybe it was Marcus's earlier joke about fashion being subjective, or maybe it was just the absurdity of the whole situation, but she lost it completely. Her laughter was contagious. Within seconds, all 7 cubs were in hysterics, unable to complete the regulation. They weren't being defiant, they simply couldn't stop laughing long enough to speak. Commander Zilthon's expression shifted through several shades of alarm. "What is the meaning of this behavioral malfunction?" Vorthak looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. They have been experiencing some minor irregularities in their emotional control systems." "Minor irregularities?" Zilthon's voice rose to what passed for shouting among the Zenthari. "They are exhibiting complete loss of regulatory function. This is not minor, this is catastrophic developmental failure." One of the cubs, brave little Zek, tried to explain. "Commander, we have learned about humor. It is when something is funny and it makes you feel good inside and you make happy sounds." The silence that followed was so complete Marcus could hear his own heartbeat echoing through the ventilation shaft. "Humor," Zildon repeated slowly, like he was tasting poison. "You have been exposed to humor?" Marcus closed his eyes. Well, it had been fun while it lasted. Time to face the music and probably some kind of galactic court-martial for corrupting alien minors. The cubs were definitely worth it, though. The Galactic Council of Elders convened faster than Marcus had ever seen bureaucrats move. Within 6 hours of the Great Giggling Incident, he found himself standing in Harmony Prime's main assembly hall, facing a semicircle of the most intimidating alien beings he'd ever encountered. And considering he'd once had to explain a broken coffee machine to Commander Zilthon, that was saying something. The hall had been transformed into an impromptu courtroom, complete with floating holographic displays showing evidence of his crimes, security footage of him crawling through ventilation shafts, audio recordings of the cubs' laughter, charts analyzing the degradation of emotional regulation among the station's youth population. They'd turned his teaching kids to laugh into a full-scale investigation. Elder Craximus, the lead council member, presided from an elevated platform that made him look even more imposing than his natural 8-foot height suggested. His elongated skull bore the ceremonial scarring of his rank, and his voice carried the weight of someone who'd spent centuries making very serious decisions about very serious things. Marcus Webb of Earth, Craximus intoned, consulting a holographic tablet that probably contained every embarrassing detail of Marcus's life. You stand accused of corrupting developing minds, introducing chaos into ordered society, and conducting unauthorized educational activities with members of a protected species. How do you respond to these charges? Marcus looked around the assembled crowd. Commander Zilthon sat in the front row, practically vibrating with righteous indignation. Keeper Vorthak occupied the witness stand, looking like someone who'd watched his life's work get demolished by a human with dad jokes. Various other station personnel filled the remaining seats, their expressions ranging from curious to horrified. Well, Marcus said, clearing his throat, when you put it like that, it sounds way more impressive than what actually happened. I taught some kids to laugh, that's it. No corruption, no chaos, just basic human emotional expression. The chamber erupted in murmurs of disapproval. Several elders exchanged meaningful glances that clearly translated to typical human arrogance. Elder Craximus raised one long-fingered hand for silence. You admit to the charges? I admit to helping 7 children discover that life doesn't have to be a series of regulations recited in monotone voices, Marcus replied. If that's a crime, then yeah, I'm guilty as charged. Keeper Vorthak, Craximus addressed the witness stand, please describe the extent of the contamination. Vorthak stood with the rigid posture of someone giving testimony at a war crimes tribunal. The subjects began exhibiting uncontrolled facial muscular contractions, irregular vocalization patterns, and complete inability to focus on essential educational protocols. Their emotional regulation scores dropped 73% in 1 week. And what specific activities did the accused engage in to cause this deterioration? Team demonstrated what he called facial comedy, involving deliberate distortion of features for no functional purpose. He engaged in wordplay, creating nonsensical connections between unrelated concepts. Most disturbing, he encouraged them to make loud repetitive sounds he termed louder in response to these meaningless activities. Marcus couldn't help himself. Meaningless? Have you seen how happy they were? When's the last time you smiled, Vorthak? And I mean really smiled, not that polite thing you do during formal ceremonies. Happiness is not a primary developmental goal, Vorthak replied stiffly. Functional integration into galactic society is paramount. Elder Thymax, a particularly ancient-looking council member, leaned forward. Human Web, you claim this latter serves a beneficial purpose. Present your evidence. Evidence? Marcus gestured toward the assembled crowd. Look around you. Everyone here is more engaged in this conversation than they've been in months. You're asking questions, showing emotion, actually caring about something. That's what laughter does. It makes you feel alive. Feeling alive is not a quantifiable benefit, Elder Thymex observed. Present statistical analyses of improved performance metrics. Marcus stared at him. You want me to quantify joy? Correct. Marcus paused, searching for words that wouldn't get him immediately ejected into space. That's the most depressing thing I've ever heard. And I once had to sit through a 3-hour lecture on proper dust distribution patterns. The council members conferred among themselves in rapid, clicking whispers that Marcus couldn't understand, but definitely didn't sound friendly. Finally, Elder Craximus called for the presentation of evidence. Bring forth the contaminated subjects. The 7 cubs were escorted into the chamber by a full security detail, as if they were dangerous criminals instead of children who'd learned to giggle. They looked small and frightened in the formal setting, their usual bright energy dampened by the solemn atmosphere. Subjects, Elder Craximus addressed them, you will demonstrate the extent of your contamination for the council's evaluation. The cubs huddled together, clearly overwhelmed by the serious adults staring at them expectantly. Marcus felt his heart break a little watching their fear. It's okay, he called out to them. Just be yourselves. Elder Craximus fixed Marcus with a withering stare. The accused will remain silent during evidence presentation. Tell us about humor, Kander Zilthon prompted the cubs. Explain what this human taught you. Little Zek, brave as always, stepped forward slightly. Marcus taught us that you can make happy sounds when things are funny. He showed us how faces can do more than just look serious. He told us stories that made us feel warm inside. And these happy sounds, demonstrate them, Elder Thymax commanded. The cubs looked at each other uncertainly. Being ordered to laugh on command sucked all the spontaneity out of it. They made a few half-hearted attempts at giggling, but it sounded forced and artificial. See, Vorthak said triumphantly, when removed from the source of contamination, they cannot even reproduce the aberrant behavior properly. That's when Pip, smallest of the cubs, looked directly at Marcus and asked, "Will you tell us another joke? A real one?" The chamber fell silent. Marcus looked at Elder Craximus, who gave him a curt nod of permission. "Okay," Marcus said, grinning at the cubs. "Why don't aliens ever land at airports?" The cubs perked up immediately, recognizing the setup for one of his jokes. "Why?" they chorused. "Because they're looking for space." The reaction was instantaneous and genuine. All 7 cubs burst into delighted laughter, their fear momentarily forgotten. But more importantly, the sound was infectious. Marcus watched as several young Zinthari in the audience began making similar sounds, unable to help themselves. Even a few adults looked like they were fighting smiles. "Stop this immediately," Elder Craximus commanded, but there was something different in his voice. Uncertainty, maybe even curiosity. "You want to know the really crazy part?" Marcus asked, addressing the entire assembly. "Every single one of you just felt something. Whether you admitted it or not, whether you liked it or not, hearing those kids laugh made you feel something. That's what makes us human, not just that we can feel joy, but that we can share it." Noodle stepped forward, her voice small but determined. "Elder Craximus, Marcus didn't hurt us, he made us happy. Is that wrong?" The ancient elder stared down at her for a long moment. "Happiness without purpose leads to chaos." "But what if happiness is the purpose?" Zek asked, with the earnest logic only children possess. "What if feeling good is reason enough?" The council members exchanged more clicking whispers. Finally, Elder Craximus rose to his full, imposing height. "The council has reached a decision. Marcus Webb of Earth, you have introduced dangerous emotional instability into developing minds. You have disrupted the carefully maintained order of this station. Your influence has proven to be a threat to the structured development of an entire generation." Marcus's heart sank. Here it came. "Therefore, you will be exiled from Harmony Prime within 24 hours. The contaminated subjects will undergo immediate re-education to restore their proper emotional regulation. This session is concluded." As security moved to escort Marcus away, he caught one last look at the cubs. They weren't laughing anymore. They looked heartbroken, confused, and suddenly much older than their years. "Don't let them take the laughter away," Marcus called out to them as he was led from the chamber. "Remember what it feels like to be happy." Elder Craximus watched him go, something unreadable flickering in his ancient eyes. In the back of the chamber, more young Zinthari were making soft sounds that might have been the beginning of laughter, and several adults were failing to maintain their regulation expressions. The trial was over, but Marcus had a feeling the real story was just beginning. Marcus had exactly 18 hours to figure out how to save 7 alien children from having their joy surgically removed by a committee of humorless elders. No pressure or anything. He'd been confined to his quarters under guard. 2 very serious Zenthari security officers who looked like they could bench press a shuttlecraft. They stood at attention outside his door, occasionally checking their chronometers with the precision of beings who had never experienced a spontaneous moment in their lives. "Hey, Officer Drunk," Marcus called through the door to the larger guard, whom he'd nicknamed after the sound his footsteps made. "You guys ever wonder what you're missing by being so serious all the time?" "Silence, human," came the predictable response. "You will await transport to the departure bay." Marcus paced his small quarters, mind racing. The cubs were probably already undergoing evaluation for their re-education process. The thought of little Zek and Pip having their laughter literally programmed out of them made his stomach churn. There had to be something he could do. That's when he heard it. A soft tapping pattern on his ventilation grate. 3 short, 2 long, 3 short. He'd taught the cubs that rhythm as a game, calling it comedy code. They were trying to communicate. Marcus quickly moved a chair beneath the vent and climbed up to whisper through the grate. "Zek, is that you?" "Marcus?" came the tiny, excited response. "We escaped from the medical bay. Noodle figured out how to override the door locks by telling the security system a joke." "Gee, what now?" "The AI asked for identification, and she said, 'I'm nobody, but knock knock, who's there?' It got confused trying to process the logical inconsistency and opened the door." Marcus grinned despite their dire situation. "That's my girl. Where are you now?" "In the main ventilation system. We're planning a rescue mission." "Kids, no. This is too dangerous. You need to get out of here before they find you." "We're not leaving without you." Pip's voice joined the conversation. "You taught us that friends don't abandon each other." Remember the story about the human who carried his injured teammate? Marcus felt his throat tighten. These brave little aliens were willing to risk everything for him. Okay, but we do this smart. Can you access the main communication array? Zeb thinks he can, Zek replied. He's been studying the station schematics during his emotional regulation therapy. Why? Because if we're going down swinging, and maybe we can make sure the whole galaxy hears us. 20 minutes later, Marcus heard his door security system chirp in confusion as it tried to process Noodle's increasingly complex knock-knock jokes. The lock disengaged, with a frustrated electronic whine. The Cubs are natural hackers, Marcus mused as he slipped out of his quarters. Who knew humor could be a cybersecurity tool? The corridors were dimmer during night cycle, casting long shadows that provided perfect cover for their escape. Marcus found the Cubs waiting at a maintenance junction, their eyes bright with excitement and terror in equal measure. This is either brilliant or the worst idea in galactic history, Marcus whispered as they began moving toward the communication center. We not both, Zek replied, and Marcus realized his lessons in human attitude had taken root deeper than anyone imagined. Their route took them through the heart of the station, past sleeping quarters and research labs, but as they moved, Marcus began noticing sounds he'd never heard before on Harmony Prime. Soft chittering and muffled vocalizations coming from behind closed doors. Young, Zenthari voices, experimenting with laughter in the safety of darkness. The contamination was spreading. They reached the communication center's outer corridor without detection, but their luck ran out when they encountered Commander Zilthon conducting a late-night inspection. The commander's elongated silhouette appeared around a corner just as they were about to make their final approach. Halt! Zilthon commanded, his voice echoing in the empty corridor. Escaped subjects and exiled human, you will surrender immediately. Marcus stepped protectively in front of the Cubs. Commander, think about what you're doing. These children discovered joy for the first time in their lives, and your response is to lobotomize them. Does that sound right to you? It sounds necessary, Zilthon replied, but there was something different in his tone. Less certainty, more conflict. Listen, Marcus said, as security alarms began wailing in the distance. I know you heard them laugh during the trial. I saw your face. Part of you wondered what that felt like, didn't it? Zilthon's large eyes fixed on Marcus with uncomfortable intensity. Irrelevant. Order must be maintained. Why? Pip asked, stepping out from behind Marcus. Commander, what's wrong with being happy? Happiness leads to unpredictability. Unpredictability leads to chaos. Chaos leads to the collapse of civilization. Or, Marcus suggested, happiness leads to creativity. Creativity leads to innovation. And innovation leads to progress. Ever consider that angle? The security alarms were getting closer. Marcus could hear running footsteps echoing through the corridors. They were almost out of time. Zeb, can you get to the communication array? Marcus whispered. The smallest Cub nodded and slipped away into the shadows while Marcus kept talking to Zilthon. Commander, your people have achieved perfect order, perfect efficiency, perfect predictability. And what has it gotten you? A civilization so static that the most excitement you've had in decades is watching a human teach kids to laugh. Is that really living? Zilthon stared at him for a long moment. Then, without warning, the commander made a sound Marcus had never heard from an adult Zenthari. A soft, involuntary chuckle. What was that? Zilthon touched his throat in confusion. That, Marcus grinned, was the beginning of understanding what you've been missing. Security forces rounded the corner just as Zeb's voice crackled over the station's communication system. But instead of speaking, the little Cub began to laugh. Pure, delighted, infectious laughter that echoed through every corridor, every room, every corner of Harmony Prime. The effect was immediate and chaos-inducing in the best possible way. Throughout the station, young Zenthari who had been secretly practicing their new emotional skills heard that sound and responded. Laughter began bubbling up from quarters and common areas, spreading like the most joyful epidemic in galactic history. But Zeb wasn't done. With the technical skills only a child raised on advanced alien technology could possess, he somehow managed to patch the station's communication array into the broader galactic network. Marcus's jaw dropped as he realized what was happening. Ladies, gentlemen, and assorted galactic beings, Zeb's tiny voice announced to potentially billions of listeners, this is Harmony Prime calling. We've got something new to share with you. It's called laughter, and it feels amazing. The Cubs' laughter, amplified and broadcast across the galaxy, reached countless worlds simultaneously. On research stations and colony ships, in alien cities and spaceports, young beings of dozens of species heard that sound and felt something stir in their carefully regulated hearts. Marcus watched Commander Zilthon's face as reports began flooding in from across the galaxy. Young beings on hundreds of worlds spontaneously breaking into laughter, much to their elders' confusion and growing alarm. "What have you done?" Zilthon whispered, but his voice held wonder rather than anger. "Started a revolution," Marcus replied, "the most peaceful revolution in galactic history." That's when Elder Craximus himself appeared in the corridor, flanked by the entire Council of Elders. But instead of the fury Marcus expected, the ancient being looked thoughtful. "Human web," Craximus said slowly, "your contamination has reached 17 sectors and 43 worlds in the past 10 minutes. Our communication networks are overwhelmed with reports of spontaneous emotional outbursts among the youth populations." "And?" Marcus prompted. Elder Craximus was quiet for a long moment, listening to the sounds of laughter still echoing through the station's corridors. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight of realization that seemed to surprise even him. "And for the first time in 3 centuries, the galaxy sounds alive." The ancient elder looked down at the 7 cubs who had clustered around Marcus protectively. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "we have been approaching development from the wrong direction." Marcus felt hope bloom in his chest. "You mean?" "I mean," Elder Craximus said, making what Marcus could swear was the beginning of a smile, "we may need to reconsider our definition of contamination." From across the galaxy, the laughter continued to spread, carrying with it the simple, revolutionary message that joy was not a threat to civilization. It was the point of it. 6 months later, Marcus Webb stood in what used to be called the Emotional Regulation Center, but had been renamed the Interspecies Joy Laboratory by popular demand. The sterile white walls had been painted in bright colors by enthusiastic young artists from 12 different species, and the rigid metal furniture had been replaced with comfortable seating that actually encouraged relaxation instead of perfect posture. It was, Marcus reflected, the most beautiful disaster he'd ever been part of creating. "Director Webb?" came a familiar voice behind him. Marcus turned to see Elder Craximus approaching, and had to suppress a grin at how much the ancient being had changed. Gone were the severe ceremonial robes, replaced by more practical clothing that actually allowed for comfortable movement. More importantly, the perpetual stern expression had been replaced by something that might charitably be called curiosity, and occasionally even resembled contentment. "Elder Craximus," Marcus replied, still getting used to his new title. "How did the council session go?" "Better than expected, worse than hoped," Craximus admitted, settling into one of the new chairs with obvious relief. "The Regillian delegation is still convinced that spontaneous emotion will lead to the collapse of interstellar commerce. The Andromedan representatives insist that laughter is a form of mental illness that requires immediate treatment. And the others are beginning to understand what we learned here," Craximus said, his voice carrying a warmth that would have been impossible 6 months ago. "The Centauri colonies report a 30% increase in creative innovations since implementing joy breaks in their research facilities. The Vegan Trade Consortium has discovered that happy workers are significantly more productive than regulated ones. Even the Vulcan Science Academy is conducting discrete studies on the correlation between emotional expression and cognitive function." Marcus looked out the laboratory's large viewport at Harmony Prime's Central Plaza, where a group of mixed-species children were playing what appeared to be an elaborate game of anti-gravity tag. Their laughter echoed through the corridors like music, and Marcus never got tired of hearing it. "Hard to believe it all started with 7 kids who just wanted to giggle," he mused. "Actually," Craximus corrected gently, "it started with one human who recognized that joy is not a luxury, it's a necessity." The laboratory doors whooshed open and the original 7 cubs bounded in with the energy of beings who had spent 6 months discovering that life could be fun. They were taller now, growing into their adolescent forms, but their eyes still held that bright spark of delighted curiosity that had first caught Marcus's attention. "Marcus," Zek called out, practically vibrating with excitement, "we just got the reports from the Outer Rim colonies. The Zephyrian hatchlings learned to laugh last week, and now their elders are requesting formal instruction in happiness protocols. The crystalline entities on Sigma-7 want to know if they can experience humor even though they don't have traditional vocal cords," Pip added, consulting a datapad that was almost as large as she was. "I told them we'd figure something out. Maybe vibrational comedy?" "And the gaseous beings from the Horsehead Nebula sent us a message," Noodle chimed in. I think it was a joke, but we're not sure because it was delivered as a series of atmospheric pressure changes that took 3 days to decode. Marcus laughed, a sound that had become as natural as breathing on the station. Sounds like we've got our work cut out for us. Speaking of work, Craxmus interjected, the Galactic Council has officially ratified the Universal Joy Accords. Every member species now has the right to emotional expression, and suppression of laughter in developing minds has been classified as a form of psychological abuse. About time, Marcus said. What about the resistance factions? Diminishing daily, Craxmus replied with what Marcus had learned to recognize as his version of a smile. It's difficult to argue against happiness when you can observe its benefits firsthand. Commander Zilthan's efficiency reports show that station productivity has increased 47% since we began implementing humor protocols in the workplace. As if summoned by his name, Commander Zilthan appeared in the laboratory doorway. The transformation in the once rigid administrator was perhaps the most dramatic of all. He'd not only learned to laugh, but had developed what could only be described as a sense of humor. His latest hobby was collecting what he called cross-cultural comedy, jokes that worked across species barriers. Marcus, Zilthan announced with obvious pride, I believe I have mastered the art of the dad joke. Oh no, Marcus said, recognizing the gleam in the commander's large eyes. Let's hear it. Why don't aliens ever get speeding tickets when traveling faster than light? Zilthan paused for effect, clearly savoring the moment. Because they're always in a different space when the officers catch up to them. The cubs groaned in unison, a response that Zilthan had learned was actually the highest form of praise for that particular category of humor. Marcus applauded politely, while trying not to let his amusement show too obviously. That's actually not bad, Marcus admitted. You're getting the hang of this. I have been studying Earth comedy archives extensively, Zilthan said proudly. I particularly enjoy what you call stand-up comedy, though I confess I don't understand why the performer must remain vertical. Sitting comedy seems equally valid. Elder Craximus rose from his chair, moving with the easy grace of someone who no longer carried the weight of maintaining perfect dignity at all times. I should return to the council chambers. The afternoon session covers the proposal to establish formal comedy exchanges between member species. Good luck with that, Marcus said. Let me know if you need any demonstration materials. Actually, Craximus paused at the doorway, there is one more thing. The council has been discussing a permanent position for you. Chief Ambassador of Interspecies Emotional Development. The role would involve traveling to member worlds, establishing joy programs, and teaching other species the principles you've developed here. Marcus considered this. 6 months ago, he'd been a janitor facing exile for teaching alien kids to laugh. Now he was being offered the chance to spread that laughter across the entire galaxy. Would I get to bring my team? Marcus asked, gesturing to the 7 cubs who had started this whole adventure. We insist on it, Craximus replied. They are, after all, the galaxy's first certified laughter ambassadors. The cubs cheered at this news, immediately launching into an excited discussion of which worlds they wanted to visit first and what kinds of jokes might work best with crystalline beings versus energy-based life forms. Marcus watched them plan their galactic comedy tour and felt that familiar warmth in his chest, the same feeling he'd experienced when he first heard them laugh. It was the knowledge that he'd helped make the universe a little brighter, one giggle at a time. You know what the best part is, Marcus said to no one in particular as he looked out at the bustling, joyful chaos that Harmony Prime had become. What's that? Zek asked, looking up from his detailed plans for teaching humor to methane-breathing life forms. 6 months ago, the most exciting thing that happened around here was a broken recycling unit. Now we're planning to teach the entire galaxy how to laugh, and somehow, that seems completely normal. Pip grinned at him, an expression that had gone from impossible to natural for her species. That's because you taught us that normal is overrated. Extraordinary is much more fun. Marcus nodded, watching a group of young Xanthari chase a gaggle of giggling Andromedan children through the plaza while their parents, former paragons of emotional regulation, looked on with expressions of delighted bewilderment. You know what? He said, settling back into his chair as the cubs continued their enthusiastic planning. I think we're just getting started. Outside the viewport, Harmony Prime hummed with the sounds of dozens of species learning that joy was universal, laughter was contagious, and sometimes the most important revolutions began with the simplest question: why shouldn't life be fun? Marcus Webb, former janitor turned director of interspecies emotional development, smiled as he listened to the symphony of galactic laughter that had become the soundtrack to his life. Not bad for a guy who just wanted to teach some alien kids that it was okay to giggle. Not bad at all.